Hello, I'm Jeorgette Knoll with the League of Women Voters ABC, which covers Anoka, Blaine, Coon Rapids, Champlin, and surrounding areas. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages the informed and active participation of citizens in government and influences public policy through education and advocacy. Each year, the League of Women Voters of Minnesota Action Committee recommends legislation for members to follow and support. The recommended bills are supported by League positions. Only after in-depth study and member consensus does the League of Women Voters develop positions that are used to advocate for change in legislation and policy. One recommended legislative issue during the just-ending session involved the need to protect Minnesota children. The League of Women Voters U.S. position supports policies and programs that promote the well-being, development, and safety of all children. The League of Women Voters Minnesota position went one step further and in addition supports adequate staffing and resources for child protection. It was with these positions in mind that the League of Women Voters supported the most recent legislative efforts. To help us understand the legislation and the issues that led up to it, we're going to hear a presentation by Rich Gehrman, founder and executive director of Safe Passage for Children in Minnesota. Safe Passage is a Minnesota nonprofit corporation created to protect and improve the well-being of children in child protection, foster care, and public adoption programs. The organization advocates for systemic improvements to Minnesota's child protection and foster care systems. Mr. Gehrman developed expertise in child welfare metrics and best practices in his work for clients, which include the Center for the Study of Social Policy, the Ramsey County ACE program, and Growing Home, a Minnesota foster care agency. His background led him to develop the core strategy and resources for Safe Passage. Mr. Gehrman has also managed projects in federal, state, and county and municipal governments in areas of health, human services, state court administration, higher education, and juvenile justice. He has worked with runaways and street youth. Mr. Gehrman has also served as the Chief Finance and Administrative Officer for the Westchester County, New York Department of Social Services, the Maryland Department of Human Services, the City of St. Paul, Minnesota, and Catholic Charities in St. Paul. He is a graduate of Williams College, Harvard Divinity School, and Harvard Business School. In 2014, Mr. Gehrman assisted the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in its investigation of child protection. Because of his vast experience, expertise, and knowledge around the issue of child protection, he was appointed to the Governor's Task Force on Child Protection that was formed in October 2014. In March of this year, the task force issued 93 recommendations that the legislature considered during the most recent session. Today, Rich will discuss the recommendations of that task force on child protection and the actions taken by the state legislature in response to the recommendation. Please welcome Mr. Rich Gehrman.
Thanks, Georgette. I appreciate it. And what I'll do is give some background in terms of what led up to the Governor's Task Force on Child Protection, and then talk about where we're going from here in terms of following up. So first, let me just set the table in terms of how Minnesota historically has responded to reports of child abuse. Historically, we only responded to about 28 or 29% of reports that come in. Reports come in from mostly mandated reporters. About 70% of the time they're reporters like school teachers and physicians and other people are required by law to report. And the other 30% is citizens, friends, neighbors, people who are aware of a situation. So 29% of those calls get a response, meaning a worker goes out and in some form does an assessment or investigation. That compares to 62% for states on average nationally. And that means historically 20 or 22,000 children a year who probably should have had someone go out and take a look at the situation, didn't get that service, and as a result often got reported many times before they finally got someone to give them some help. However, as a result of the recent scrutiny that we'll talk about and the tightening up of standards, those percentages are increasing. We don't know what they are yet, but we hear anecdotal information that in some cases maybe doubling or increasing by 50 or 60%. So that number is shifting in the right direction. So let me just say briefly who we are, who is Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota. As you indicated, we're an advocacy group and we're a citizens group. We're all volunteer, people who are interested in this issue, concerned about children, who are, and many of them have had some kind of contact with the child protection system as mandated reporters or guardians ad litem or in some other capacity. So they have a lot of concern about what's happening to children who are victims of child maltreatment. And by child welfare, we basically mean the core public sector programs that respond to child abuse reports and also the foster care system that follows from that. So it's a very focused set of programs. Our mission at Safe Passage is to rebuild the child welfare system in Minnesota so children are safe and reach their full potential. And I think the safe part is fairly self-explanatory, but the full potential bears a little more explanation. I will go into that later when we start talking about outcomes. And then long-term, our vision, and in some ways this is similar to the League of Women Voters, long-term we want to make sure that there is always a group of citizens in Minnesota who consider it their job to be looking out for and watching over victims of child maltreatment. So we want this to be a longer-term citizen engagement opportunity for people. So bringing it down to a level of goals, our goal has been to change child welfare laws and practice and policies so that first of all we measure outcomes for every child. We want to be able to tell if when children get into the child protection system they're doing better or not as a result of the system's response. And to make child safety, secondly, and well-being the primary response of the system and concern of the system. And third, to reinvest in child welfare because there have been many cuts that I will talk about. So if I can, let me talk a little bit in more detail about the program problem that we've had over the years in Minnesota. We did some research with the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota, and we looked at nearly 100 cases, court cases in Hennepin County. They're called CHIPS cases, Child in Need of Protection and Services, and these are the cases that get all the way through an investigation and into the courts. And some of the things we found, for example, were that many children are reported 10 or 15 or even more times. Often those reports don't get a response, and when they do, the response may not be effective. 70% of children who finally get screened in have gone to what's called a family assessment program. And that was a program originally designed for lower risk cases, but over the period of time it's been in effect, it became more and more a default process where kids went into those family assessment and then they often were offered voluntary services and the family refused the services and the case was closed. So it became kind of a churning and a cycling of children being reported over and over again and then being reported, designated for this voluntary program and then kind of going out the back door. So a lot of cycling through. In fact, only 11% of the families that went into that program in Hennepin County in our research study actually ever got services. So that'll give you a sense. Also, we found in this that it takes almost 4 years, 47 months on average for that case to get to court from the time of the original petition. And then 36% of children experienced additional maltreatment while under the protective supervision of the courts. So they weren't safe even when it finally got to the court process. And then 29%, almost nearly a third of cases, were closed with the same list of high-risk factors that caused the case to be opened in the first place. So this will give you a sense of the futility in many respects of reporting cases for child maltreatment. And it's Hennepin County may not be the same as all the counties around the state, but there are many similarities from other data that we've obtained. As I mentioned, family assessment program was originally intended to for low-risk cases, but as the percent that were assigned to that went from 30 to 75%, there were many high-risk cases, including hundreds of sexual abuse cases assigned to that every year. And since it's primarily a voluntary program, the way it's actually implemented, that means that those children didn't get protected. I should say that different counties implemented that different ways, and in some it was less voluntary, but on the whole, there weren't a lot of requirements for families that got into that program to follow through on whatever the court required. And then this is also, family assessment is known nationally, the term for it is differential response. And so it's a program that has been used by a number of states and has been recently challenged in terms of the research that supported it. there are some very credible researchers coming out and saying that, that the evaluations have been, haven't been as thorough as they should be or as robust, and that the outcomes that were reported for these differential response programs need to be looked at more carefully. That's the program problem in terms of how we implement. In terms of resources, many of you know, many of your members will know that Minnesota is a state-supervised, locally administered state in terms of many social services and mental health programs. So that means that the counties actually run the program, whereas in about 40 states it is run directly by the state. So this means, and some counties have combined social services, but basically there's 85 or 86 different ways of doing business out there because there's 2 tribes and some counties have combined, so there's about 84 county agencies. And each of them has over time developed their own way of doing business. That's one piece of the issue structurally. Secondly, Minnesota has been the second lowest state nationally in terms of how much the state contributes to child welfare programs. So that is partly because we're a state supervised county run system, so the state doesn't manage the program, but even of those ones where the state just contributes to the program, we're the second lowest. So that means counties have paid for most of the services, and as the state has cut money over the years, they've cut about $25 million out of their contribution since 2002. More and more of the burden has gone on the counties, and they have other pressures on their tax base, and so the program has been cut. It's difficult to know exactly how much just because it's so spread out, but it's been cut substantially. And then there have been federal and county cuts on top of the state cuts. So it's been about a $41 million cut a year in these programs out of a total budget of about maybe $340 million. So a very substantial reduction. So this year, and we'll talk more about what happened in the budget, but the legislature, as of the day before yesterday when the session ended, had approved a significant new funding for the counties. And so that includes, it's $52 million and at $52.5 million for the biennium. That comes out on an annual basis to about $22 million for counties, earmarked for counties, which they can use to replenish their staff or rebuild their support services. And then $3 million a year for pilot projects to address racial disparities. As many people are aware, Minnesota has great racial disparities generally in terms of services and education. In child protection, we're about twice as, we have twice as great a disparity in terms of the number of children in the system for African Americans as the average state, and about 4 times as many for Native Americans. So we have a much worse disparity gap than the average state. So the $3 million a year will go towards some pilot projects, as I said, and some research to figure out what's working elsewhere so we can begin to tackle that issue. And then about $1.25 million a year for new staff for the State Department of Human Services. And that's good because it's very difficult to get more money for state staff, but the way that Minnesota has worked over the years, the state has really not played a strong role in terms of oversight of the counties and of the program, partly because they didn't have the staff, and it was partly just the way that the corporate culture developed on this program. But that means that there haven't been sufficient checks and balances in the system on counties to make sure that they're working appropriately. So this will help them to develop a quality assurance program or to strengthen the one that they have, to make sure that cases are being screened in appropriately and handled responsibly, expand the fatality review reporting process, improve training, and then there'll be a big process to kind of really totally rethink the guidelines for what is considered child maltreatment in Minnesota. So those are the big pieces of the budget, more money for the counties, racial disparities, and the state. So we talked a little bit about the problem with the philosophical problem, if you will, with this family assessment approach. And just to give a couple of specifics about how that works, the traditional response is an investigation, and that means that someone goes out and does kind of a forensic investigation to figure out if abuse or neglect happened, and then there's a finding, and if there's a finding that it did happen, it goes into a central registry, and if it's serious enough, it goes to court. That's the traditional track. Family assessment is built around the concept that if you can get families to work with you more cooperatively, then you can keep out of the courts and things will go better. But there's been kind of a carrot but no stick in that. There hasn't been any real accountability for parents to actually follow through. So parts of that are, for example, they're workers were discouraged from doing any collateral contact. So if you got a call from a teacher that were concerned, then you would not be encouraged to talk to the school nurse or to a therapist or to some other professional involved with the family. So that really is sort of like, we don't want to know all the things that happen. It was kind of deliberately avoiding finding out information that affected the safety of the child. A second piece of this is that the first step in the process in family assessment is to sit down with the whole family together, including the alleged perpetrator and the alleged victim or victims. So sit around the kitchen table or in the living room and kind of say, well, what happened? Well, obviously, the children are not going to feel comfortable if something is going on, saying it in that environment. Key decisions about cases are made before there's very much information. So there's this process is a call comes into a screener at a county who's often not a highly trained person. If they think that it is at the level of child maltreatment, they hand it off to a supervisor and maybe a senior worker, and they decide whether to do an investigation or family assessment before they go out and see the family. So there's very little information at that stage. And as I said, it's used increasingly for high risk cases, which by law required an investigative response. So that's the issue, the tension around the family assessment program, and the reason many advocates are involved is their concerns about that. I think many people have heard about the consequences of delaying a response to an abuse situation. Many people are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences research that is out there, but let me just briefly talk about what that is for those who aren't familiar with it. This is research that's been done mostly by the Center for Disease Controls and then Disease Control, and then kind of spun off to other universities. And one of the things it shows is that when children are exposed to severe abuse or neglect, their brains don't develop normally. So if you're at the stage where your brain is kind of turning on to learn language, for example, and it only stays on in that, in that area for a certain period of time, and all of your energy is focused around safety or survival, then you don't learn language properly. And after a certain period of time, your brain goes on to the next stage, and that part of your brain kind of shuts down. And so each of these steps is a building block for what happens later. So if children are in a constant period of what's called toxic stress, which means high enough to cause this to happen, then they don't develop normally. The building blocks aren't there, and it's very difficult to go back and put the pieces together later. It affects things like their IQ. Children lose IQ points year after year if they're in stressful situations, ability to bond with other people, what's called executive function, which basically means self-regulation, self-control, and ability to read social cues, all of those things that children learn in the first few years of their life. So that's kind of the background for the system as it has been in Minnesota for the last 20 years or so. So let me just shift and tell you a little bit about how we work in Safe Passage for Children. We simply train volunteers, and they go talk to their elected officials. They talk to members of the public. They do some presentations, generally educating people to what's going on in child protection. One of the big advantages of taking an all-volunteer kind of approach is that legislators will almost always meet with a constituent, and so we've been able, through our volunteers, to kind of get in front of, at least a third and sometimes more of legislators during each session. In terms of citizen engagement, which is something that I know the League is very interested in, it's a very lean, relatively inexpensive model for doing advocacy work because volunteers volunteer their time. And compared to the traditional advocacy approach, which is usually based on a think tank, we're about 20% as costly to implement this approach as the traditional strategy. We're nonpartisan and not ideological, so we literally have volunteers from the Tea Party to the Green Party, and we also have support on both sides of the aisle in the legislature. And it's sustainable. One of the reasons that we did this, in my experience in government, I saw many child welfare reform efforts that got success for a period of time and then kind of faded away. And the reason for that was that they were all based on a handful of leaders, usually the state commissioner and a few legislators, who decided it was time to do something about child welfare. But then they inevitably moved on to other tasks, or they weren't elected or whatever. And so it wasn't sustainable. So we were deliberately looking for a model of engagement that did not have that problem, and that's where you can always renew a volunteer base. Think of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, or or the mentoring programs, and individual volunteers may come and go, but you have the ability to maintain that base. So it's more sustainable. And then it engages citizens in issues, in our case, a particular issue that benefits the community overall, so very similar to the League in the sense that people aren't there because they're going to get some benefit from their lobbying. They're there because of the kids. So perhaps the most important piece of our long-term strategy is basing the system increasingly on outcomes for children. We want to be able to measure outcomes, and this follows a plan that was originally developed by the federal government, the Children's Bureau of the federal government, and it is now kind of moved to where Chapin Hall, which is a think tank at the University of Chicago, is kind of taking ownership of it, but it has a lot of support in that respect. It's got a lot of people who are very smart, have thought through this whole process. The basic idea is to do an assessment using a normed instrument when children come into the system, starting with an assessment for trauma, to see what level of trauma it is. And then as you update that over time and re-administer the assessment, the children's level of trauma should go down. So that's an objective measure of whether the system is actually doing what it's supposed to do. And the plan then is to start with that trauma assessment and then over time to add other measures such as cognitive and physical development and behavioral health and mental health. So this will begin to form a whole package that you can take into court with an individual child, that the workers and supervisors can look at to see if what they're doing is working, and then you can roll those numbers up to see how a worker, a unit, a county, the state are doing as a whole. So that's based on my experience in government. The one thing that works in terms of motivating people is if you give them a report card on how they're doing relative to their peers, or you give one county set of board of county commissioners a report on how they're doing compared to a similar county. People want to get good grades. Nobody wants to get a D on their report card. So it does motivate people, and if you can figure out the right things for them to work on and measure, then they will continuously improve the system. And I believe in it because it's the one strategy when I was in government management positions that actually worked. So let me talk about what led up to this year's legislative session and what the outcomes of that were. Many of your members will know that there were a series of stories in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune on child protection. There were a couple that came out in May of last year and early in the fall that didn't really go anywhere, but around Labor Day, there was a story about a little boy, a 4-year-old named Eric Dean, and he was reported on 15 occasions to the child protection authorities in Polk County. Child care workers had photos of him. He had human bite marks. He had black eyes. His arm was twisted in a way that it was twisted right out of his socket and broke. There were clear signs and signals that this was not a kid who was falling, bumping into walls. They were ignored. He was screened in for family assessment twice, and then the case was closed without any services. And then he was ultimately he died. There were other children as well. There was another story on a boy named Demond Reed a couple of weeks later. He was 4 years old. He was found in a closet in his home. He had been kicked. He had been burned down to the bone, and he left in the closet for several days to die, and he ultimately died from blood poisoning from the burn. And he had many fractures and other signs of previous trauma, had been reported 6 times to Child Protection. So one of the things that we hear is, well, this is all about this one little boy, Eric Dean, who's a kind of a little white boy in a rural county, and it doesn't really apply to a lot of other areas of the state or communities. But the Star-Tribune then did stories on all 56 children who had been killed by their caregivers from 2005 on. And by the way, there have been at least 8 more since that report came out last fall. And so this is a systemic problem. It's not about one little boy and an overreaction to that death. So that story in particular led the governor to appoint the Task Force on Child Protection that you mentioned. And the charge was to review policies and laws and protocols and to come up with ways to improve accountability and to analyze capacity and resources, which basically means is there enough money in the system. And as you mentioned, the final recommendations were released at the end of March. I have to say that there was strong support from the governor for this and excellent leadership from the Department of Human Services. They have been, as I have said, kind of playing a fairly light role in this, but they really stepped up. The commissioner and a new assistant commissioner, Jim Koppel, assumed a lot of leadership on this. And Jim Koppel was previously the director of the Children's Defense Fund, so he has an advocacy background. And that really helped the task force to move forward because we got good leadership from the state level people there. I think the counties were very committed to this family assessment program, so they really struggled to, agree to many of the recommendations, but in the end we did work through to come up with a consensus report. So let me tell you what some of the key recommendations from a policy point of view are in practice. First of all, the primary responsibility, according to law now, will be the safety and well-being of the child, as opposed to giving priority to family assessment, which is about family preservation and reintegration of families after kids have been in foster care. Secondly, counties have to follow the same guidelines for child abuse and neglect. Historically, the state has put guidelines on which the counties reference, but then they often expanded on them or changed them or adapted them to their counties. And so we had 87 different ways of doing business around the state. The time required to keep information about screened out reports is going to be increased from 1 year to 5 years. So Safe Passage had gotten legislation passed the previous year to require counties to keep enough information on cases they screened out so you could see in each county how many children had been reported 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 times. So that was a start, but that got expanded to 5 years. The commissioner was required to develop a quality assurance program. Counties have to share maltreatment reports consistently with law enforcement and the county attorneys. That was in the books, but it wasn't, it was more honored in the breach and the observance, so this was strengthening that requirement. There was a law that was passed last year that the Department of Human Services sponsored that told counties, told workers that when they were screening a case, they could not look at past reports of child abuse. They had to screen each one based on just the information in that report, which of course meant a lot of cases were screened out where there were patterns that probably should have caused it to be screened in. That requirement has been abolished, and now workers will be required to look at past reports. Increased use of collateral context, requiring them instead of requiring they not be used, and developing multidisciplinary teams. So, and then we talked about the increased leadership role for the Department of Human Services, so that will be good. So where do we go from here? I think that we are really much further ahead than we expected to be at this point in time because of these recommendations from the task force. They include all of our stretch goals for what we would have liked to see accomplished by 2018, and those were really stretch goals. But really the Star Tribune series kind of gave a booster rocket to what we have been doing. And I think what we had contributed is our volunteers have been down there for at least 5 years educating legislators about this situation. So they had some point of reference when the Star Tribune series came out, and the legislators began to say, well, who knows about this issue and who can we talk to? And as did other media outlets, and people often referred them to us. So that's how we kind of got in, into the mix in terms of the governor's task force. So a lot of that, as you can see, really was a result of the fact that the volunteers had built up this awareness in the legislature for those years. But implementation, it's really, a lot of this is supposed to be implemented in the next 2 years, but it's like a career's worth of recommendation to implement. So we are going to have to, our next role is really to stay on top of the implementation, make sure that people don't forget about it, that it actually gets followed through on it. We also think that the next stage is going to mean focusing on more prevention because we will be bringing many more families into the system as a result of tightening up the standards. So in order to really make this work, we're going to have to start doing things like targeted home visiting and more early childhood opportunities for children and evidence-based parenting skills training, things of that nature, so that we don't have as many people who need to come into the system. So that's basically the overview and how we got here, and what I'd like to say in terms of League of Women Voters members and chapters. There's a number of things that people can do, and there's some contact information at the end of the PowerPoint that's going with this. The easiest thing to do is to sign up for our weekly policy blog. We call it an e-brief. It's very short. It takes 30, 45 seconds to read, so we find people read it often. And it gives a little policy insight into child welfare each week. Secondly, we love volunteers. It doesn't need to conflict with any other volunteer commitments people have. We just go to the legislature a couple of times a year or even once a year and maybe visit representatives in districts. And we train people to do that and usually send them with someone who's experienced the first couple of times. And we ask volunteers to be ready to email their legislators, as you do during key points in the session when things are moving through committee. And then we would love opportunities to come out and visit with League of Women Voters chapters, and perhaps down the road even pull together a forum in different parts of the state where we invite stakeholders and elected officials to really talk about child protection issues. And we're always open to ideas in terms of other things that people would like to do. So with that, let me stop and see what kind of questions people may have, and I can expand on this.
Thank you. And now we're going to take a few questions.
Wake the sun, tell him that I've begun to dream of things to come, and tell the trees not to look for me. I'm going to find some peace of mind. Wake the sun, wake the sun, wake the sun, wake the sun.
Thank you, Rich, for that very informative update. Now we have a few questions from the audience. The first one, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the Star Tribune article series on child protection.
Well, it was the initiative of a reporter named Brandon Stahl who first got into this, and his editor had said to him, well, what's new to talk about in child protection? Because over the years they've done a number of similar kind of investigative reporting series that really didn't result in reform. And so he had to persuade his editor that this was worth doing, but he felt confident from what he had picked up in the press and so forth that there would be a story there. So a couple of people referred him to us at the Safe Passage, and we met with him early on. I think what we contributed to is we gave him a fairly in-depth kind of briefing and understanding about how the system works, who the players are, other people he should talk to, and I think most importantly where to get the data. And there's an obscure provision in the child protection law which says that any citizen can ask for a report on a child fatality. And so he took it from there and contacted the counties for every child fatality that he could find since 2005. And it took him months of effort to get those reports from the counties and to compile them. He was extremely tenacious about this, and that's after that effort, that's where he started a series. There were about 6 stories in the series, and it was, as I said, after the Eric Dean one that people really started paying attention to that. I think there's no question that we would not have had the reforms we had this year were it not for that investigative reporting series in the Star Tribune. We had done a lot of the work, to, as I said, to build up and to educate people, but then it took off, and so we had the opportunity to take it, to start really talking about reforms.
Thank you. It was a very influential series. One other question, with all our information technology we have available to us, could you tell me if there is a statewide shared database system, or if there is plans to have one regarding child protection?
One of the recommendations of the Child Protection Task Force was to increase workers' access to information across counties. So up until this point, I'm not sure I have all the details down in the weeds, but my understanding is that workers could see if there had been a prior report, or if there was an open case in another county recently. But weren't able to see the history of reports or what reports got screened in and out, what the allegations were. So they'll be able to see that. They'll do some changes to the computer system so that they'll be able to see if a family moves from one county to another to avoid child protection, it'll be much easier to pick it up going forward. I hasten to say, I'm glad you asked that, because one of the things that we did not get this year that we're going to be trying to advocate for in future years is improvements to the IT systems in the state. We have a system that is very old and creaky, and it's not really usable for getting the kind of management reporting or child level reporting that we need. But from many years of managing state and county budgets, I know that IT improvements are one of the hardest things to sell. But the reason it's really important is that if we can update that system, every hour we save of workers' time trying to get that system to work and putting data in goes directly to more casework. And so that's really important. And also just what seems like simple things, which is to have technology in the field where you can have a laptop and they can enter the data once and not have to then go back, write it down, go back and key it in. That would save a lot of worker time. But we weren't able to kind of get that in this session, so we'll be going back after it.
Would that also include information for first responders, like the police department or others who are called to a potential child protection case?
I don't think that police or first responders will have access to the state social services information system, it's called, but one of the strong recommendations of the task force were to develop multidisciplinary teams in counties. Stearns County has kind of the best process that we know of, and Rochester, Olmsted County has another, but essentially there's either a deputy sheriff or a sergeant from the police department, if it's a city, who sits on who sits down generally on a daily basis with the child protection supervisor and a couple of staff people and a county attorney. And they go through all the new reports of child maltreatment that came in the last 24 hours. So you have 3 sets of eyes or 3 organizations involved. You get better decision making. It's easier. It's not as easy to take a situation and not respond to it if it's serious enough. And often those other entities know the family and they can come up with much more nuanced responses. Say the police may have someone in the high school and have a relationship with one of the kids and be able to say, well, how's things going and what. So that's something that it'll be tricky because rural areas are spread out so far that getting people together on a daily basis isn't going to work. And then in the urban areas, there's a lot of concern, particularly communities of color. If you just start sharing information back and forth with the police, that there'll be increased scrutiny that may not be appropriate. So it's really important to sit down and think through the process so that everybody knows their role and they're not just getting faxes about reports over at the police station and running out to see what's going on. I'm not sure if that responds completely to your question, but that's one of the more important recommendations from the task force.
Well, along with that, is there any place that parents can turn when they're absolutely at their wits' end?
That's a tough question. One of the things that happened with these cuts over the years is the kind of infrastructure of social services that are, in the child protection world pretty much got decimated in a lot of counties. Some counties just stopped purchasing services like mental health services or parenting skills training and just brought everything in-house and did the best they could with their workers. So there's just not a service array out there that in most cases, in many counties that is going to be able to respond except to the most serious circumstances. There is one program that the Department of Human Services got some additional money for in another part of the budget called Parent Support Outreach Program, and it's supposed to be for cases that are, not quite serious enough to get into the child protection system. Historically, a lot of cases that were way more serious enough than needed to get into the system were put in this Parent Support Outreach Program. But that'll be expanding, and when counties have gotten that money, they've been able to do pretty good work with it. So we're hopeful that's one piece.
One question from the audience is, what is the range of rules, laws in the counties in Minnesota?
Well, I alluded to that when I was talking about the guidelines. The Department of Human Services has a fairly substantial, very robust document with guidelines for what constitutes child maltreatment, and it's 15 or 20 pages long. It's based on the standards from the American Humane Association and Child Welfare League of America, so it's pretty good. But what's happened historically is that counties have taken that as advice, and actually the legislative auditor used that term, is that it's merely advice or suggestions about what is child abuse, and so each county and tribe have more or less developed their own. And as a result, it's really gotten out of hand. So what this task force has done is we'll set up a process to really thoroughly go through those guidelines, update them and upgrade them, and then develop training along those lines. So I guess the short answer is there hasn't really been much order to that process and to common standards and guidelines across the state, but we'll be in the process of creating that.
How much can the state mandate policies and procedures?
Well, that's along the same lines. Historically, there are, as I said, about 10 states. Some people count states one way or the other. Say roughly 10 states where the state has an oversight role, and the counties manage the programs. But from my experience, and I've worked in 2 other states with that same structure, New York State and Maryland, we are way at the far end of the counties kind of taking full responsibility, and the state kind of providing some training and advice and best practices information, pretty hands-off historically. So what this task force has done is set up put in some funds and set up some structures where there will be much more oversight. And so the way that the state could have effective oversight without being burdensome will be to start collecting data on child-level outcomes. That will be and feeding it back to the counties and doing quality reviews. And so they will have the staff to do more quality reviews, both in screening decisions and deeper into the case when they have a case plan. So those quality, they don't have the power to, in theory, they could find counties or something of that nature. That's probably not going to happen. What they do have is the power of information to feed it back and say, here's where you are relative to your peers or relative to the standard, and here's where you need to improve.
As far as the governor's task force goes, is the task force finished with their work, or are they going to continue? And what is the future? What legislation are you didn't you get to cover this year that you might be looking to do next year?
Well, the task force itself did end on March 31st. However, Representative Joe Mullery, who was a member of the task force, has proposed, and I believe it was passed, and I haven't actually looked at it, but I understood it was passed, which would have a legislative version of this task force, smaller and not as active, but to check in periodically with the Department of Human Services to make sure that they are following through with the recommendations. That's one piece. In addition, the recommendation of the task force were to set up several groups, one to rethink the Child Fatality Review Report, make it more transparent, and have more rigorous follow-up on their findings, and to look at the racial disparities grants to make sure they're crafted in a way that we really get some good responses, and then thirdly to go through a process, bringing in some national experts and bringing in stakeholders from the state to revamp the guidelines for child abuse and neglect. So those are the pieces that are continuing.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you for your work on behalf of Minnesota children, and thank you for sharing with the League and our viewers. You can find more information about Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota by going to their Facebook page, Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota, or by going to their website, and you can search Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota. Information about the League of Women Voters of the U.S., the League of Women Voters Minnesota, and about local leagues can be found on the League of Women Voters U.S. and League of Women Voters Minnesota websites and Facebook pages. And thank you to QCTV for helping the League of Women Voters to publicize the efforts being made to protect Minnesota children. Thank you.
Thank you.